There was once a man in Ulster named Crudden. He was a farmer and a good man, but he had a terrible misfortune. His wife Cara got very sick, and though he cared for her as much as any loving husband could, it was to no avail. Cara died, leaving him with 3 young children, and only himself to take care of them. His house was in disarray, and every day he had to get up and make breakfast for them. Then he'd leave Nuala, the eldest, and only being 10 years old herself, in charge of her 2 little brothers. Then Crudden would head out of the house and go and work in the fields till evening time. One day when he came home from a long day at work, he came through the front door, expecting to see the house upside down and the 2 little boys fighting with Nuala. But to his astonishment, the house was neat and tidy. The children were spotlessly clean, and not a peep out of them. A beautiful woman was sat by the fire cooking dinner. Crudden broke the silence and spoke first, asking the woman her name. The woman told him her name was Macha, and that she had heard of his terrible misfortune at losing his wife Cara, and that she herself had decided to be his wife and to take care of him and his 3 young children. So as not to argue with this great fortune, Crudden settled into married life again. Macha was a perfect wife, and true to her word, she kept the house like a new pin, and she adored the children. The children loved her in return, as did Crudden. He knew she was a woman of the other world by the way she looked, with her long flowing black hair and her emerald green eyes. More than her looks, though, was how Macha moved. She could run so swiftly that her feet barely touched the ground. Neither of them made a fuss over this, and they both went about their lives as it was enough for both of them taking care of the children and each other. One day the King of Ulster, Conor, summoned all his people to a great feast at his fort. The feast was to celebrate the king's purchase of a fine new team of chariot horses that he had just brought back from Dalriada in the west coast of Scotland. Crudden was looking forward to getting away for a few days, while he could catch up with friends that he hadn't seen for a long time. That night before the great feast, while sitting by the fire, the little farmhouse was quiet, and the children were fast asleep. Macha got up from her seat and kneeled down close to Crudden. She held his hand and looked deep into his eyes. Then she began to speak. "My dear Crudden," she said, "when you go to the fort of King Conor, you are not to speak of me, and you must not boast of me either, for if you do, you will bring a terrible disaster down upon us." Crudden gently squeezed her hand, and made a solemn promise he would not. When morning came, Crudden had breakfast with his family. Then he hugged them and headed off to King Conor's fort. When Crudden walked up to the fort, he was met by friends and family alike, and there for all to see were the new horses. They were beautiful, grey and swift, and perfectly matched. Everybody ate and drank, thanks to the king's great generosity. Music played and time flew by. It wasn't long before some of the men began boasting about the beauty of their wives. But Crudden remembered Macha's warning, and he sat back and said nothing. Then others began boasting about the great cooking of their wives, but Crudden bit his lip and stayed silent as a lamb. But when King Conor boasted that no creature in Ireland was faster than his new horses, Crudden broke his silence, and bragged aloud that his wife was so swift of foot that she would beat the king's new horses in a race. At this terrible insult, King Conor jumped to his feet, and at the top of his voice he ordered his men to grab the boastful farmer. He demanded that Crudden send for his wife at once, and if she did not come to prove the truth of his outburst, then Crudden would pay for his lie with his life. Men were sent to Crudden's house, but when Macha opened the door, they could see that she was heavily pregnant. Nonetheless, they told her what her husband had said, and if she did not come at once, he would pay for his boast with his life. Macha had no choice but to go. Before she left, she took Nuala aside and told her to take care of her 2 brothers and not to worry. She would be back as soon as she could. When she stood before the king, Macha begged him to reconsider her condition, and to please postpone the race until she had given birth and had suitable time to recover. But the king had been brooding on Crudden's insult, and especially as he had done it in front of all his people, and he refused her pleas. Then Macha turned to all the warriors of Ulster, the Red Branch Knights, assembled there, and asked them to intercede and protect her. She reminded them that each of them was born of a woman, and that it was not right for the king to put her in this position. But alas, none of them stepped forward for her. Not one would plead to the king. They all had been drinking at the feast. They were all eager to see the race, and to see the king put this boastful farmer in his place. Something about Macha must have given King Conor pause, because before the race he had his charioteer strip back all the decorations on the chariot, all the cushions and cloths that made the ride easier, till the king's chariot was barely a plank of wood with wheels, and as light as it could possibly be. He then stripped off all his armour and heavy cloak, till he stood in his light linen tunic. He then dismissed his sister Una, who was his charioteer, and took the reins of the chariot himself. Macha waited. The race was held on the huge lawn outside the king's fort, where there were no stones or uneven ground to trip the horses, or foul the wheels. All the men of Ulster gathered there to watch, as the king and Macha raced. The king raced his new matched grey horses, and they ran as swift as the wind, moving in perfect unison, pulling him so fast he felt like he was flying. But if the king raced as fast as the wind, then Macha ran faster. She outpaced the wind itself. Her feet seemed barely to touch the ground, but as she ran, the bird pains came over Macha, and she began to scream. All the people watching felt suddenly that this was not the great sport and entertainment that they had thought it was. Screaming in agony, Macha ran the course that was laid out in front of her, and beat King Conor and his grey horses. Then she collapsed onto the grass. Moments later, her twins were born still and dead. She gathered them into her arms and put a curse on all the warriors of Ulster, for failing to use their strength to defend her in her hour of need. Macha declared that their strength would become useless to them whenever they needed it most. Their strength would desert them, and for 9 days and 9 nights they would endure the pains of a woman in childbirth. This curse would last for 9 generations. Each man of Ulster, as soon as he was old enough to grow a beard, would come under the curse. With that, Macha stood up, and holding her dead twins tightly to her chest, she closed her 2 eyes and simply disappeared. From that day forth, the fort of King Conor and the King of Ulster was known as Ewan Macha, the twins of Macha.